Hello and welcome to the podcast series entitled In the Footsteps of St. Francis de Sales. My name is Father John O'Neill and I am an oblate of St. Francis de Sales. It will be my pleasure to be your host as we journey in the footsteps of this great saint. In this podcast we will focus on the chapel at Les Allinges and the remnants of the two castles that compose the large fortress. We will then consider other topics of interest related to the Chablais region of present-day southeastern France. It was in this region that Francis de Sales would serve as a missionary in this Calvinist territory during the Counter-Reformation. It was in 1594 when, as a young priest, St. Francis de Sales was given the daunting task by the Bishop of Geneva, His Excellency Claude de Granier, of entering the Calvinist Protestant stronghold of the Chablais to convert the population back to Roman Catholicism. By some estimates, there were only about 200 Catholics remaining in the region, the total population of which was estimated to be several thousand. Upon the conclusion of de Sales' mission 4 years later, the entire region was Roman Catholic, with less than 200 Protestants in the Chablais. On this visit to the Chablais, I owe a great debt of gratitude to Father Yves Caron, missionary of St. Francis de Sales, pictured here, who is the current provincial superior of the French Swiss province. Father Caron was a font of knowledge of the religious and cultural history of the Chablais, as well as an indispensable guide to the most important Salesian sites of the region. I'm also very much indebted to the missionary of St. Francis de Sales community at Val-le-Grand, France, which abuts the Swiss border, for their gracious hospitality to me personally and their unfailing support of this project. The word Chablais derives from the two-word expression given to the region by the Romans, caput lacei or laci, which in Latin is translated as head of the lake. The Latin expression, which was later rendered into the French, became Chablais. The term is given to the area located at the tip of the southern end of Lake Geneva. St. Francis de Sales visited his parents before taking on this assignment as a missionary. Francis's father, Monsieur François de Boissy, who had expressed his strong opposition to his namesake becoming a priest in the first place, was also adamantly opposed to Francis entering the Chablais as a missionary, saying to the effect, "I have already given my son to the church to be a priest, not to be a martyr." Francis's father finally relented to the mission, but would not allow his son or his cousin Louis to take anyone else into the Chablais. As a result of this admonition, the two young clerics had to travel very lightly and carried what they needed in a small sack. In addition, as a further condition of his approval, Monsieur de Boissy, fearing for their safety, also insisted that the pair not stay in the Chablais overnight, but had to return each night to the fortress of Allinges, which was under the protection of the Baron de Hermance, who was a personal friend of Monsieur de Boissy. This first image of Les Allinges, representing the two castles as they appeared at the time St. Francis de Sales undertook his mission to the Chablais. Amazingly, the two castles were erected approximately 150 yards apart at different periods by enemy barons. There is a basis for believing that the original or old castle was built in the 5th century and that the new castle was built in the 15th century. There doesn't seem to be any evidence to indicate why the owner of the first castle constructed would even permit the construction of a second castle located in such close proximity. In the 17th century, the owners of the new castle destroyed it so it would not fall into the hands of the Protestants. The second image represents the new castle, or Château Neuf, as it appears today. Remnants of the old castle, or Château Vieux, are still visible on site. One of the important Salesian landmarks in the region is the Cross of the Chablais, which is also known as the Cross of Chandouse, named after an alpine torrent nearby. It is in this spot, marking the entrance to the Chablais, where Francis de Sales knelt with his cousin Louis on the Feast of the Holy Cross, September 14, 1594, and prayed to the guardian angel of the Chablais for protection for their missionary efforts. You can see in the first image of the present sequence is a well-known depiction of the two missionaries kneeling in prayer to the angel. The cross presently in place was put there by a local parish of St. Georges, Gergues, in 1868. Father Caron mentioned that it may be of interest to note that around Geneva, the area of Savoy was referred to as Les Genevois, or the Geneva region, and there was a kind of border between the Genevois and the Chablais. The cross is situated at that border. Next, there is a copy of a print depicting St. Francis de Sales preaching to the simple people or peasants of the Chablais. Among the many instances of considerable danger that occurred to the saintly missionary, one evening occurred upon returning to the fortress at Les Allinges. Francis was attacked by a pack of wolves and took refuge in a tree for the night. At dawn, he was discovered by some Calvinist peasants in such an exhausted condition that they took him into their home to revive him with food and warmth. There is little doubt that without their help, he would have surely died. Francis's response was so filled with gratitude and charity that he won over the hearts of his rescuers, who later returned to the faith. It is also reported that some of the local inhabitants, even to this day, can point out the actual tree that Francis was said to have climbed to safety. Another story recounts that on one night the temperature was so cold that the saint sought shelter in the warmth of a local baker's oven. Finally, there were at least two occasions in 1595 when St. Francis was attacked by Protestant extremists, nearly killing him, but he was miraculously able to escape from them. As was mentioned, the original or old chateau of Les Allinges was constructed in the 5th century. In the 10th century, the old chateau was restored and the new chateau was built under the dynasty of the Rodolphians. Then in 1335, Count Amédée VI of Savoy became the sole master of both castles. The location of the chapel and its entrance at Les Allinges can be found towards the end of the building to which it is attached. Fortunately, the chapel itself was not destroyed during the conflicts between the Catholics and the Protestants, Calvinists. Next in the series of images depicting the chapel itself, its altar, and the apse. The frescoes in the apse date back to the 10th century and are among the oldest in Savoy. In the chapel, there is a frame chart describing the frescoed images. The largest image in the center of the apse is that of Christ in glory, holding the text from Scripture that says, "I am the light of the world." Attached to the border of the bearing of Christ are semicircular images of the four evangelists, Saints Matthew and Mark on the left, and Saints John and Luke on the right. The standing images are of the Virgin Mary on the left, and on the right side is that of St. John the Apostle, into whose care Mary was entrusted by Jesus at his crucifixion. In the lower frame are four virtues. The inscription for the first of the four virtues on the left is no longer readable. However, the three remaining virtues are those of charity, humility, and patience. The Treaty of Nyon in 1589 restored the Chablais to the control of the Catholic Duke of Savoy. Nevertheless, the Calvinists from Geneva continued to destroy Catholic churches in the region, as well as occupying the principal city of Thonon, from which they banished some 50 priests. It was not until King Henry VI of France renounced Protestantism that the dispute over control of the region was finally resolved by a truce on July 31st, 1593. It was shortly after that, again at the request of the Duke, that in 1594 Bishop de Granier asked St. Francis de Sales to enter into the Chablais as a missionary. Even in the midst of more than 2 generations of intense conflict between the Catholics and the Protestants, there were still deep Catholic roots in the Chablais. Many of the inhabitants were positively disposed to returning to the faith of their family's religious origins. However, they were prevented from doing so for a number of reasons. Protestants were in control of the region economically, politically, legally, and socially. So for an individual to obtain employment be selected for regional public office, or be accepted by his or her neighbors, there was enormous pressure for them to remain Protestant. Thus, there was a strong animosity towards anyone who considered conversion from Calvinism to Catholicism. On the grounds of the fortress of Les Allinges, there are two memorials commemorating tragic events which occurred in the year 2008. The first was a terrible accident that happened on June 2nd, in which 7 7th grade students, or in the French system, members of the 5th level of the education, from the middle school at Margencel, were killed in a collision involving a school bus and a train at Messanges. A quote at the end of the monument says, "Our 7 stars smiling on life, their memory will forever rest upon our hearts." To further compound the tragedy, later that year, the student's history and geography teacher took his own life. Nearby to the memorial tribute to the students who were lost in that tragic accident, there is also a memorial to their teacher in the shape of an apple with the following engraving to his memory: Eric Landin, whose conscience was dearer to him than his life. The international Salesian community has been blessed that since 1840 there has been a religious community of the missionaries of St. Francis de Sales living on the hill at Les Allinges. At that time, Bishop Monsignor Pierre-Joseph Ray requested that the founder of the missionaries, Father Peter Mary Mermier, keep the religious pilgrimage to St. Francis alive throughout the centuries and entrusted this holy site to the missionaries. These religious also help in the parishes of the region as pastors, assistant pastors, one of whom is chaplain at the Visitation Monastery in Thonon. This concludes the podcast presentation on the Chablais and the fortress of Les Allinges. There's also another podcast in the series dealing with this region entitled Thonon-les-Bains, the principal city of the Chablais, as well as the chapel of St. Stephen in Vangy, where St. Francis regularly celebrated Mass. Both of these sites are several miles from Les Allinges. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the Chablais and Les Allinges. I hope you will continue your journey in the footsteps of St. Francis de Sales, both historically and spiritually, in some one of the other podcasts available in this series. Thank you.